It started on a frozen morning in Alaska, when a 65-year-old veteran was just trying to exercise in peace. But a local karate coach, known for his ego more than his skill, decided to mock him in front of his entire class.
Please, Coach Keller.
He didn't know the old man still carried the calm, unshakable spirit of a soldier. Nor did he expect a stranger and his German shepherd to be watching from the trees. What happened next would shut down the arrogance in that park and teach everyone there what real strength looks like. The morning in Anchorage carried the kind of cold that could bite through layers of clothing. The sky washed in pale silver as low clouds drifted above snow-covered pines. The public park, usually lively in summer, was nearly empty except for the lonely figures who dared the frigid dawn. Jim Walker, a 50-year-old U.S. veteran with a rugged frame and sharp features shaped by years of hard service, walked calmly through the snow. His military cold-weather parka, thick, olive, windproof, rustled softly as he moved. Beside him trotted Rex, his 3-year-old German shepherd with a powerful build, intelligent dark eyes, and a natural instinct to guard. They were on their usual morning routine, savoring the silence of Alaska. Jim's breath drifted like smoke in the air as he followed the narrow trail leading toward the center of the park. The cold didn't bother him much. After years deployed in unforgiving climates, this felt almost familiar. His gait was steady, disciplined, the way soldiers never quite lose the rhythm of their past lives. Rex stayed close, ears flicking at every distant sound. The quiet morning, however, broke suddenly when faint shouts echoed through the grove of frosted birch trees ahead. Jim slowed, his instincts tightening. Rex's posture shifted immediately, ears up, muscles tensed, as if the dog sensed trouble before Jim even saw anything. As they approached the open training field near the frozen pond, the source of the noise became clear. A group of karate students, about a dozen teenagers wearing white GIs, were practicing strikes and drills. Leading them was Coach Keller, a man around 40 with a stocky, muscular build and a square jaw lined with trimmed stubble. His dark hair was slicked back, and his sharp eyes carried an intensity that could quickly tilt into aggression. Keller was known around town for his talent, but also for his short temper and large ego. Even from afar, Jim could sense the man's dominance-driven personality in the way he barked orders. Standing near the edge of the training space was an elderly man bundled in an old olive military jacket. His name was Raymond Cole, a 65-year-old veteran of the 10th Mountain Division. His thin frame and silver hair contrasted with his alert posture, evidence of a man who had once been strong and disciplined. His weathered face carried deep lines of fatigue, but also a quiet dignity. Raymond wasn't trying to interfere. He had simply paused on the walking path, careful not to step onto the training area. But Keller, visibly irritated, accused him of blocking the way and getting in the middle of the drills, raising his voice loud enough for all students to hear. Jim watched as Raymond raised both hands in a calm, almost apologetic gesture. Despite the freezing air, Raymond's voice was gentle as he explained he only asked them to shift slightly so the kicks wouldn't reach the pedestrian path. Instead of listening, Keller stepped closer, puffing himself up in front of his students. The teenagers, sensing tension, slowed their movements and glanced nervously toward the confrontation. Rex let out a low, instinctive rumble. Not aggressive, but a warning. Jim placed a steady hand on Rex's neck, silently keeping him calm while he assessed the situation. Keller moved even nearer to Raymond, his expression twisting with irritation. The contrast between them was stark. A fiery-tempered coach dressed in crisp white against a tired old soldier wrapped in a jacket that still bore unit patches faded by time. Raymond maintained his composure, speaking slowly, but Keller interpreted it as defiance. The wind cut through the trees, carrying Keller's harsh words across the field. Jim felt an old, familiar tension coil in his chest, the kind that appeared whenever he witnessed power being abused. He had seen this type of man before, loud, insecure, and willing to bully those weaker than him to feel strong. The students shifted uncomfortably, whispering among themselves. They were mostly teenagers, 16, 17, bundled in GIs with cheeks red from the cold. Their eyes darted between Keller and Raymond, unsure whether they were watching a lesson or an injustice. One girl with freckles and a red scarf wrapped around her waist stepped back slightly, sensing something was wrong. But none dared speak. Keller's dojo reputation was built on strictness, and the students had learned to stay silent when he was angry. The morning sun reflected off the snow, lighting the tension like a spotlight. Rex growled again, louder this time, his fur bristling as Keller leaned inches from Raymond's face. Jim felt his heartbeat slow, a sign of the calm that came over him whenever trouble escalated. He stepped forward without hurry, the deliberate pace of someone who never rushes into conflict but never shies away either. His boots crunched through the snow, catching Keller's attention. Jim's posture, straight-backed, shoulders squared, telegraphed seriousness. The cold wind whipped through his parka, but his expression didn't change. His gray-blue eyes remained hard and controlled. Keller turned, irritation shifting toward the new arrival. Jim finally reached the group, Rex at his side, the dog's breath forming white clouds as he stared at Keller. The coach raised an eyebrow at Jim's presence, clearly annoyed at being interrupted. Jim didn't speak immediately. Instead, he studied Keller with the steady gaze of a man who read danger like a written language. Raymond looked relieved at Jim's approach, but remained quiet, as if not wanting to make things worse. Around them, the students held their breaths, sensing that the atmosphere had changed. Jim stopped at a comfortable but assertive distance, his voice quiet but firm when he finally spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply asked Keller to step back and calm down, reminding him that the man he was yelling at was not a nuisance, but a veteran deserving respect. Keller scoffed, clearly unused to opposition, especially in front of his students. The air grew sharper, the wind colder, as the tension between the three men thickened. Rex stood tall beside Jim, his gaze fixed on Keller. The quiet park, once peaceful, then hostile, now teetered on the edge of something about to break. Raymond Cole barely had time to finish his calm explanation before the situation escalated. The cold wind swept across the training field, rattling the branches as if warning of what was about to happen. Raymond stood with his hands lowered, a worn-out veteran's patience in his expression. He had the look of a man who had survived mountain warfare, stoic, alert, yet gentle. But Coach Keller, fueled by embarrassment and ego, stepped forward aggressively. Without warning, Keller lifted his leg and delivered a powerful front kick straight into Raymond's chest. The force sent the 65-year-old veteran stumbling backward, his boots sliding on the compacted snow until he fell hard onto his back. The group of teenage students gasped in unison, the sound sharp against the morning silence. One boy with shaggy brown hair and round glasses took a step forward instinctively, but stopped, afraid to challenge the authority of his sensei. A girl with dark braided hair and tan skin covered her mouth in shock. They had seen Keller angry before, but never striking an elderly man. Raymond grimaced as he clutched his chest, pain radiating through his ribs. His breath turned shaky, fogging the cold air. He struggled to sit up, his old military jacket scraping against the icy ground, snow clinging to the faded patches that marked his service decades ago. Jim Walker reacted before he even fully realized it. At the moment Keller's kick landed, Rex barked sharply, an alarm, protective and fierce. Jim's instincts flared like a switch being turned on. He lengthened his stride into a brisk walk, boots crunching hard through the snow. His posture was controlled but unmistakably purposeful. Beneath his thick military cold-weather parka, his muscles tensed in readiness. Jim had seen cruelty and arrogance in many forms, both on foreign soil and within his own country, but watching a man half Keller's age brutalize an elderly veteran struck something deep inside him. Rex remained at Jim's heel, his breath steaming, eyes locked on Keller with heightened alertness. Keller's chest rose and fell with adrenaline. The coach pointed down at Raymond as if the older man had committed a crime, instead of merely speaking. "I told you to stay out of the way," Keller barked loudly, ensuring his students heard every word. His square jaw tightened, and his dark eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of asserting dominance. But beneath that bravado, a flicker of insecurity lingered, one that Jim noticed immediately. Jim had met men like Keller in the service, loud, prideful men who mistook fear for respect. Keller flexed his hands, still fired up, unaware that Jim's approach would change the entire tone of the morning. Raymond struggled onto one elbow, trying to catch his breath. Despite the pain, the old veteran did not shout or curse. His face, lined deeply from years of hardship, held quiet disappointment rather than anger. He looked smaller than before, the fall having rattled his frail body. His silver hair was dusted with ice, and his dark green eyes squinted against the cold as he tried to steady himself. One of the teenage boys finally whispered, "Sensei, he's old. You didn't have to." But Keller shot him a glare so sharp that the boy's voice died instantly. The atmosphere thickened with fear and shame. Jim finally reached the circle of stunned students, stopping a few feet from Raymond. His eyes locked onto Keller with the cold precision of a man trained to read threats. "Enough," Jim said, his voice low but carrying through the frozen air like a blade. His gray-blue eyes narrowed, and his angular face stayed firm, unmoving. The parka collar framed his jaw, and frost glinted on the fabric. Keller turned toward him, visibly irritated by the interruption. The coach scanned Jim from head to toe, perhaps expecting an out-of-shape passerby, but instead found a hardened, battle-worn veteran standing before him, posture sharp, calm, and unshaken. Keller's confidence faltered for just a moment. Rex stepped slightly forward, placing himself between Jim and Keller, tail stiff and stance defensive. His amber eyes stayed locked on Keller with unwavering focus. A deep, rumbling growl vibrated from Rex's chest, controlled but undeniable. The teen subtly shifted backward, impressed by the dog's disciplined readiness. Jim placed a steady hand on Rex's shoulder, grounding him without needing a word. His cold breath drifted into the air as he looked down briefly at Raymond. "You all right, sir?" Jim asked, voice softer but still edged with concern. Raymond nodded weakly, though pain etched itself across his face. Keller scoffed loudly, trying to maintain control of the situation. "This old man needs to learn respect," he snapped. "He stepped into my training area. I'm responsible for keeping my students safe." His words rang hollow, covered in cheap justification. Jim turned his gaze back toward the coach, taking one slow step forward. The snow crunched beneath his boots with deliberate weight. "He asked you to shift your line so you wouldn't accidentally kick someone," Jim replied. "Instead, you kicked him deliberately." Jim's calm tone held more power than a shout ever could. The students exchanged uneasy glances. This stranger spoke like someone who understood authority, discipline, and consequence far better than their coach did. Keller's frustration built quickly. His cheeks reddened, not just from the cold, but from the growing realization that he was being challenged in front of his own students. His masculine pride, already fragile, cracked beneath the surface. "Who do you think you are?" Keller demanded, stepping forward aggressively, his muscular arms tensed under the lightweight GI. The teens stiffened. Several instinctively stepped back. Jim didn't react, didn't flinch. His expression remained unchanged, carved from the same cold iron as the Alaskan winter. "Someone who won't stand by while you assault an elderly veteran," Jim answered calmly. The line cut through the frigid air like a warning. Raymond finally managed to push himself upright, wincing as he held his ribs. He cast a grateful but pained look toward Jim, recognizing the quiet strength of a fellow serviceman. Rex stayed alert, ears perked and stance firm, blocking any attempt Keller might make to move closer. The entire training field felt suspended, as if the snow itself paused mid-air. The teenagers no longer looked at Keller with admiration, but confusion and fear. And Keller, for the first time that morning, felt the weight of a real opponent standing in front of him, one who needed no rank, no title, and no dojo to command respect. The conflict had only begun, but the balance of power had already shifted. Jim stood between Raymond Cole and Coach Keller with the calm authority of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations. The cold wind swept across the field, flinging specks of snow into the air, but Jim remained steady, his gray-blue eyes fixed on Keller with unwavering focus. "That's enough," Jim said, voice low but unmistakably firm. The students felt the temperature shift. This stranger wasn't raising his voice, yet his presence carried weight. Keller's jaw clenched, clearly irritated by the challenge. Rex stood pressed to Jim's right side, the German shepherd's body tense, ears angled forward, emitting a growl so low that the snow itself seemed to vibrate around them. Keller stepped closer, shoulders squared, jaw jutting forward as if ready to reassert dominance. He towered in his white GI, breath steaming in the frigid air, muscles rigid beneath the thin fabric. "I don't need a lecture from a passerby," Keller snapped. "This is my class, my field, and I have the right to correct any behavior that disrupts training." He flicked his eyes towards the students, performing his authority like a stage act. But several teens looked away, uncomfortable with the aggression. One boy with sandy blonde hair and a long, narrow face shifted uneasily, clutching the edge of his GI jacket. A girl with short, icy blue dyed hair, pale skin, and sharp brows took a small step backward, sensing something dangerous unfolding. Jim didn't move. His boots remained planted firmly in the snow, his parka's high collar brushing his jaw as the wind pushed against him. "You didn't correct behavior," Jim said, voice even. "You kicked a 65-year-old veteran. There's nothing honorable or martial about that." Keller's nostrils flared. The accusation cut deeper than any physical strike. Jim continued. "You don't build discipline by humiliating people weaker than you." Rex took another step forward, stance protective, his breath rising like steam. Raymond remained behind Jim, one hand still clutching his ribs but eyes steadying. He saw something in Jim that reminded him of real men he had served with, controlled strength, not loud bravado. The tension grew heavier with each passing second. Keller looked around at his students, trying to salvage control. "He walked into the training space," Keller argued sharply. "He ignored my instructions. He disrespected the boundaries of this dojo." Jim tilted his head slightly, reading every tell in Keller's expression. The insecurity, the defensiveness, the bruised ego. "He asked you to shift to avoid kicking pedestrians," Jim replied calmly. And he spoke respectfully. "You escalated it." Jim's tone held no aggression, but the certainty behind his words made Keller feel exposed in front of his students. The instructor's face flushed, not from the cold, but from the realization he was losing the room. Raymond exhaled slowly, feeling the pain in his chest. Ease under Jim's protection. "I wasn't trying to interfere," Raymond said, voice raspy but steady. "Just didn't want anyone hurt." His words struck several students harder than Keller's commands ever did. The blond boy raised his hand slightly, as if to support Raymond, but quickly lowered it, afraid of Keller's reaction. Keller flicked a glare toward the students, his authority cracking. Jim noticed the shift immediately. He could see the mix of fear and doubt in the young faces. Children caught between loyalty to their teacher and the truth they'd just witnessed. The blue-haired girl's breathing quickened. She clearly wasn't comfortable with aggression, perhaps having seen it in a past she rarely mentioned. Keller turned back to Jim, shoulders rising and falling as he tried to regain composure. "Listen," he snarled. "This is none of your business. You don't get to walk into my space and tell me how to run my class. I've trained for decades. I've earned my rank." Jim's expression didn't budge. "Rank means nothing if you forget the principles behind it." Keller opened his mouth to retort, but Rex's growl deepened, low, steady, and unmistakably threatening. The dog's amber eyes locked onto Keller's movements, reading tension in his muscles. Jim placed his hand on Rex's shoulders again, grounding him with a gentle but deliberate press. Several parents who had been watching from the nearby path moved closer, drawn by the confrontation. One woman in her late 40s, with curly black hair and a round face flushed by the cold, stepped forward hesitantly. She wore a heavy blue winter coat and had a worried crease between her brows. "Coach Keller," she said cautiously, "I think the gentleman has a point. Maybe we should all calm down." Her voice trembled, not from the cold, but from the courage it took to speak against the instructor. Keller shot her a hard stare, the same kind he used to silence disruptive students. But this time it didn't work. The crowd was shifting. Jim recognized the moment, the fragile turning point where truth began to outweigh intimidation. He stepped slightly closer, keeping his posture open but firm. "This doesn't need to escalate," Jim said. "Just apologize. Show your students that strength includes humility." The idea seemed to strike Keller like a physical blow. His clenched fists loosened, snowflakes landing on his knuckles. His mouth opened, forming the start of a retort, but nothing came out. The blond boy watched him intensely, waiting for the man he once admired to show integrity. The girl with blue hair bit her lip, silently hoping for the same. Raymond shifted his weight, grimacing slightly but lifting his chin. "Son," he said to Keller quietly, "I've met warriors, and I've met bullies. You decide which one you are today." Keller's breath hitched. Something about Raymond's calm, wounded dignity pierced through his defenses. For the first time, he looked uncertain. Not angry, not proud, but unsure. The wind swept lightly across the field, stirring the snow in soft spirals around their feet. Jim stood perfectly still, letting the weight of the moment settle. The students watched with wide eyes, breaths fogging the air as they waited for Keller's choice. Keller finally took a step back. His shoulders lowered, and his eyes flicked to his students, reading their silent disappointment. Then he looked at Jim, this stranger who stood with the quiet strength of a man who had seen real battlefields. Keller's voice, when it finally came, wasn't loud. "Maybe I overreacted," he muttered. It wasn't an apology yet, but it was the first crack in his armor. Jim nodded slightly, acknowledging the step. Rex relaxed a fraction, though his eyes never left Keller. Raymond drew a slow breath, relieved but still holding his ribs. The field fell quiet once more, but this time the silence held something new. Respect shifting, power realigning, and a lesson forming in the cold Alaska air. Keller might not have admitted defeat, but everyone present understood the truth. A stranger had walked into the park, and with nothing but calm conviction, had changed everything. The air in the snowy field shifted the moment Keller's expression hardened. His breath came out in sharp bursts of steam as he squared his shoulders and stepped forward with the posture of a man who believed strength came from speed and aggression. Jim Walker didn't move. He simply watched, his gray-blue eyes steady, his military cold-weather parka fluttering slightly in the wind. Keller let out a frustrated growl and lunged, his right fist cutting through the cold air in a straight punch aimed at Jim's jaw. The students gasped, watching wide-eyed as their coach attacked with the same intensity he used in competitions. But Jim simply tilted his head a few inches, allowing the punch to pass harmlessly beside him. Keller spun into a follow-up strike, trying to turn momentum into advantage. He lowered his stance and swung a roundhouse kick toward Jim's ribs. Snow flew from the ground as Keller moved with surprising agility for a man of his muscular build. But again, Jim made only the smallest adjustment, shifting his weight onto his back foot and letting the kick sweep past with inches to spare. Keller's foot slammed into empty air, throwing off his balance. Jim didn't counter. He simply observed. Rex watched from Jim's side, his body coiled, eyes sharp, ready to intervene if necessary. Raymond Cole stood a few feet away, clutching his ribs but mesmerized by how effortlessly Jim handled the confrontation. Keller snarled, anger pulsing through each movement. "Stand still," he barked, feeling humiliation push him toward recklessness. He tried a rapid series of punches, jab, cross, hook, his breath growing heavier with each swing. Jim's movements remained minimal, almost serene, his boots crunching softly as he sidestepped or leaned just enough to avoid contact. To the untrained eye, it looked like luck, but to anyone who understood combat, it was mastery. One of the students, a tall boy with short curly hair and dark brown skin, whispered to the girl beside him, "He's reading every move, like he already knows what coach will do." The girl, her blue-dyed hair catching flakes of snow, nodded silently. Keller launched a sudden low kick aimed at Jim's knee, hoping to force him off balance. Jim, however, shifted his foot half an inch and raised his knee, deflecting the kick with the subtle precision of someone who had spent decades understanding leverage and timing. The impact jarred Keller more than Jim. Frustrated, Keller pushed forward again, swinging another aggressive hook. Jim finally lifted an arm, just one, redirecting the strike with a smooth parry, the movement controlled and efficient. The force Keller put into the punch now carried him past Jim, his feet slipping in the snow. He stumbled, desperate to recover his footing before the watching eyes of his students. Jim took one single step, guiding Keller's arm downward with a subtle twist of his wrist. The motion, gentle yet firm, pulled Keller forward, his balance unraveling beneath him. The coach's boots skidded on the thin layer of ice as his body pitched sideways. Jim didn't yank or strike. He simply redirected motion with the ease of handling an unsteady door. Keller let out a startled grunt just as his back hit the snow with a dull thud. Rex barked sharply, not out of aggression, but as if punctuating the sudden shift of dominance. The students reacted in shock, several covering their mouths, others leaning back instinctively. Keller tried to scramble up immediately, pride burning hotter than the cold could ever touch. Snow clung to his white GI and eyebrows as he pushed to his feet. "Again!" he snapped, voice cracking with rage and embarrassment. He charged at Jim with renewed fury, launching into a spinning back kick fueled by frustration more than technique. Jim took one step forward, closing distance rather than retreating, and placed his palm calmly on Keller's shoulder mid-spin. It was a simple touch, yet perfectly timed. The spin lost form instantly. Keller's foot hit the ground awkwardly, his center of gravity collapsing. Jim guided him downward again, this time with even more care, making sure Keller fell gently rather than violently. The second fall was worse for Keller's pride than the first. He sat in the snow, breath heaving, face flushed red beneath the crisp winter light. Jim stepped back, giving the man space without threatening him. "Stop," Jim said quietly. Not a command, but a boundary. Keller looked up, fury simmering beneath humiliation, his fists clenched in the snow as flakes drifted over his muscular forearms. "I'm not done," Keller growled, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. The students exchanged anxious glances. A girl with long black braids whispered, "He's going to get hurt if he keeps going." A few nodded. Even the bravest among them sensed the imbalance in skill. Keller forced himself upright again, trying to salvage dignity. His breaths were ragged now, each inhale sharp in the cold. He swung a final wild punch, more like a desperate attempt to reclaim authority than a trained strike. Jim caught the punch. Not with force, but with an open palm that absorbed the momentum and halted the movement gently. Jim's fingers closed around Keller's wrist with firm control, and with a quiet pivot of his hips, he guided Keller sideways. The coach's boots slipped once more, and Jim lowered him to the snow as though helping someone sit rather than throwing him. Keller's anger dissolved into silence as he realized he had no chance of touching the man before him. Jim released Keller's wrist and stepped back, his posture relaxed but still alert. The wind grew softer for a moment, snow drifting in slow spirals as if the world itself had paused to acknowledge the outcome. Keller remained kneeling, chest heaving, eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked human. Not a tyrannical instructor, but a man made small by his own arrogance. The students watched, their view of Keller shifting irreversibly. Raymond Cole straightened slightly, despite the pain, respect shining in his tired eyes, as he looked at Jim. Rex moved closer to Jim's leg, sensing the fight had ended. Jim lowered his voice, addressing Keller with the quiet firmness of someone who knew violence but chose restraint. "Strength isn't about how hard you hit," Jim said. "It's about control, respect, and knowing when to stop." Keller stared at him, breath rattling. The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They carried the weight of lived experience. Behind them, the students stood in a semicircle of silence, absorbing the lesson more deeply than any kata they had ever practiced. The snowy field, moments before stained with tension, now felt open and still. Keller finally exhaled, shoulders sagging. His pride had taken a beating far harder than his body. He lowered his gaze briefly, unable to meet Jim's eyes. The humiliation was visible, but so was the dawning realization that he had crossed a line no black belt ever should. Jim stepped aside, allowing Keller space to gather what remained of his dignity. The teenagers looked at Jim with a mixture of awe and relief. This stranger had stopped a dangerous escalation with nothing more than precise skill and unwavering calm. Raymond nodded once at Jim, gratitude shining through his fatigue. And with that, the confrontation reached its quiet, inevitable end. The snowy training field fell eerily quiet after Keller's third fall. The only sounds were the faint hiss of wind slipping between the birch trees and the uneven breaths of the karate students watching their sensei crumble under the calm precision of a stranger. A thin boy with shaggy brown hair adjusted his glasses nervously, unable to look away from Jim Walker. The girl with blue-dyed hair clutched her GI jacket, eyes wide with disbelief. None of them had imagined seeing their instructor, known for his strictness and intimidating presence, unable to land a single strike. Jim stood relaxed, boots planted firmly in the snow, breath steady, parka steady in the wind. The contrast made the defeat sting sharper. A pair of older men who had been walking the path nearby stepped closer. They were both local veterans who often visited the park, one tall with a gray beard trimmed short, wearing a heavy brown coat, the other shorter, bald, with a thick scarf wrapped around his neck. They watched Jim with widened eyes, their expressions shifting from curiosity to recognition. "That's not dojo movement," the tall veteran muttered, his voice hoarse with cold and memory. "That's battlefield timing." The shorter man nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Jim's footwork. "He's not reacting, he's predicting. That's training you don't get in any civilian class." The words floated through the cold air, reaching the students like a revelation. Keller pushed himself up again, snow clinging to his GI and arms. His chest heaved, and his face burned with humiliation. He looked around at the circle of faces, his students, the veterans, and the growing number of parents stopping to witness the confrontation. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes, not fear of Jim's strength, but fear of losing the authority he'd built on intimidation. A woman in her early 50s with red cheeks and a knitted scarf whispered to another parent, "That man, he moves like a special forces operator." Her tone was hushed but confident, as though she was remembering someone she once knew in the service. The parents exchanged glances, puzzled and intrigued. Jim didn't step forward or speak. He simply observed Keller with steady calm, allowing the man to catch his breath. Rex stood beside him, the German shepherd's muscular frame still tense, but the growl gone. Rex's amber eyes watched Keller with the same disciplined focus Jim displayed, as if the dog was trained not merely for companionship but for protection. Raymond Cole stood behind Jim, leaning slightly on one leg to relieve pressure from his bruised ribs, but his eyes were sharper now. He recognized the stance Jim held, shoulders relaxed but ready, weight balanced, gaze constantly reading movement. Raymond had served long enough to know what real combat experience looked like. Keller's gaze flicked down to Jim's boots, then up to the parka collar brushing his jaw. He noticed the small scratches on Jim's knuckles and the faint scar running from the side of his eyebrow to his temple. His mind raced. "Who are you?" Keller managed to ask, his voice cracking from the cold and the shame of repeated defeat. It wasn't an aggressive question anymore. It was an uncertain one. Jim didn't answer immediately. His silence held authority of its own, as if the truth didn't need explanation. The students leaned in unconsciously, their breaths forming small clouds as they waited for the response. Before Jim could speak, the tall veteran from earlier stepped forward slightly. "He's military," the man said, voice carrying across the field. "I'd bet my pension on it. That footwork, you only learn that from people trying to kill you for real." Keller's face paled slightly. The students turned toward Jim with newfound awe. The blue-haired girl whispered, "So that's why he didn't even strike back." The glasses-wearing boy nodded. "He didn't have to." Their perspective shifted. Jim was no longer just a stranger. He was a figure carved from real experience, the kind their sensei had always talked about but never truly embodied. Keller swallowed hard, the weight of truth pressing against him. He forced himself to stand straighter, though the tremor in his legs betrayed his shaken confidence. You think you can come here and embarrass me in front of my students?" he said, but the anger in his voice had thinned. Jim tilted his head slightly. "You embarrassed yourself," Jim replied simply, his tone level, almost gentle, but the words hit harder than any strike. "I didn't throw a single punch. You fell because you lost control." A murmur spread through the parents and students. The honesty in Jim's words made Keller's facade crack even further. Raymond stepped forward a little, his breath visible in the cold air. "Son?" he said quietly. "That man saved you from hurting yourself worse. You were fighting with pride, not discipline." The older veteran's voice carried a weight of lived hardship. Mountain campaigns, frozen nights, brothers lost. Keller turned slightly toward Raymond, and for a moment, something human flickered in his expression. Shame mixed with resentment, mixed with realization. The field seemed to tighten around the three men, the falling snow catching light like drifting sparks. A teenager who hadn't spoken yet, a tall girl with long auburn hair tied in a ponytail, freckled cheeks, and a lean, athletic frame, stepped forward from the student circle. She looked around 16, and her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Sensei, you always tell us that martial arts is about respect." She glanced at Jim, then Raymond. "But today, you didn't show it." Her statement hung in the air like a verdict. Keller blinked at her, stunned more by her honesty than the words themselves. The other students slowly nodded, one by one, creating a silent chorus of agreement. Keller's shoulders slumped. The arrogance that had fueled his outburst drained out of him like warmth into the snowy ground. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked less like an intimidating instructor and more like a man forced to confront the truth of his own actions. He started, but words failed him. Jim didn't press or judge. He simply waited. Behind him, Rex let out a soft exhale, sensing the tension beginning to loosen. The parents shifted, some folding their arms against the cold, others tucking their scarves tighter as they watched Keller struggle with the realization of what he'd become. The snowfall grew lighter, flakes drifting down like feathers, as if the storm itself was easing. Jim's calm presence did more than diffuse a fight. It revealed the fractures in Keller's character, fractures that had long been hidden beneath rank and intimidation. The tall veteran spoke again. "Son, there's no shame in losing to someone with more experience. The shame is when you refuse to learn from it." Keller's eyes flicked to him, then down at the ground. He clenched his fists once before forcing them open again. He had always believed respect came from fear. But in that moment, he realized how wrong he'd been. Finally, Keller looked up at Jim, the arrogance gone. His voice, when he spoke, was hollow but honest. "I didn't know who I was dealing with," he admitted. Jim nodded once, not in victory, but acknowledgement. "Now you do," Jim replied softly. Keller breathed out, a long, slow exhale that turned to mist in the air. He looked at his students, seeing their disappointment and their quiet hope for him to be better. Something softened in his expression. And for the first time, he understood that the man standing before him wasn't his enemy. He was the mirror he needed, but never wanted. Jim stood motionless, while the snow drifted around him, each flake catching in the folds of his military cold-weather parka. His breath formed a slow mist in the frigid air as he watched Keller struggle with the weight of everything that had just unfolded. The karate students stood in a wide semicircle, frozen as if afraid even to shift their feet. Rex paced once around Jim's leg, then sat, alert but calm. Keller's shoulders sagged. The pride that had fueled his anger minutes earlier now felt like a burden he could no longer carry. Jim took one small step forward, not aggressive, not triumphant, simply present. "This isn't about winning," he said quietly, his voice steady in the cold wind. "It's about knowing yourself." Keller's breathing slowed as he looked at Jim, with something between fear and confusion. His face, normally tense with stern authority, softened into a weary, defeated expression. "I lost control," Keller muttered, words barely audible. A few students exchanged glances, surprised to hear honesty from the instructor who rarely admitted mistakes. The girl with blue-dyed hair lowered her gaze, as if she felt second-hand embarrassment for him. The tall boy with glasses took a small step forward, but stopped halfway, unsure of his place. Jim tilted his head slightly, studying Keller. Not judging, but assessing, reading the man like a battlefield situation where restraint meant survival. Snowflakes drifted onto Keller's GI, melting slowly against the fabric. Control is the first rule of any discipline, Jim continued softly. Strength isn't the power to hurt others. It's the choice not to. Keller flinched at the words as though struck. Standing in the cold, white expanse, surrounded by silence and hundreds of watching eyes, Keller's facade cracked further. A parent, the woman in the purple scarf from earlier, clasped her gloved hands together and whispered, "God, he needed to hear that." Rex turned his head briefly toward her voice before returning his focus to Keller, sensing the shift in tension. Raymond Cole stepped forward with slow, stiff movements, holding his ribs gently. His breath came out uneven but determined. The old veteran's silver hair, dusted with snow, shone under the pale Alaskan light. His face was lined with fatigue and lingering pain, yet his eyes held warmth and dignity. Keller looked at him, shame rising in his throat. "Mr. Cole," Keller said softly, unable to complete the thought. Raymond offered a small, tired smile, not mocking, not vengeful, just human. "Son," Raymond said, voice rough but steady. "Every man loses control sometimes. What matters is what you do once you realize it." The students shifted quietly, their breaths billowing in the frozen air. One of them, a short boy with spiky black hair and broad shoulders, looked between Keller and Raymond with newfound understanding. "Sensei always talked about character," he whispered. "Guess today's the real lesson." The snow crunched as a new figure approached from the edge of the clearing. An older woman around 60, bundled in a thick gray parka, with soft brown eyes and long streaks of silver in her hair. She had been quietly watching from a distance. Her expression carried the compassionate firmness of someone who had seen many storms, internal and otherwise. She stopped beside the students and nodded at Jim respectfully. She didn't speak, but her approving presence added a new layer to the atmosphere, someone whose judgment carried weight. Keller's throat tightened as he looked at Raymond again. I shouldn't have done that," he forced out. His hands trembled slightly as he clenched them at his sides. "I let my ego run wild. I embarrassed myself and—" His voice cracked, but he didn't look away. Jim watched silently, letting Keller find his own footing. Rex approached Raymond, gently brushing his head against the old man's leg, as if urging him forward. Raymond nodded gratefully at the dog before lifting his chin toward Keller. "Respect," Raymond said, "begins when pride ends." Keller swallowed, eyes burning with humility and exhaustion. Slowly, deliberately, he bowed to Raymond, a gesture he usually demanded from his students but rarely offered himself. The bow wasn't dramatic. It was hesitant, stiff, but sincere. The cold air seemed to quiet further. Some of the teenagers gasped softly. Others lowered their heads in solidarity. The girl with auburn hair and freckles placed a hand over her chest, breathing deeply as if something heavy had lifted. Keller held the bow for several seconds before rising, his face red not from anger, but from the sting of accountability. Raymond stepped closer, offering a weathered hand. "Apology accepted," he said simply. His voice carried the strength of someone who had endured far harsher winters, both literal and metaphorical. Keller stared at the hand before finally taking it, gripping it with a mixture of relief and remorse. When they released, Jim nodded in approval. The tall veteran with the gray beard crossed his arms and smiled faintly, murmuring to the man beside him, "There it is. That's the moment that matters. The older woman in the gray parka smiled warmly, pride lighting her tired eyes as she watched Keller change in front of his students. Jim turned toward the teenagers, addressing them directly. "You all saw something important today," he said. His voice held the quiet weight of someone used to commanding attention without raising it. Martial arts isn't about breaking boards or winning fights. It's about discipline, humility, and protecting those who can't protect themselves. The boy with glasses nodded eagerly. The girl with blue hair wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered, That's the part Sensei forgot." Keller winced at the comment but didn't react harshly. Instead, he let the truth settle. The snowfall had eased into a gentle flurry, softening the edges of the cold world around them. Keller looked at his students, seeing not fear or admiration, just honesty. "I lost my way," Keller admitted, voice thick. "But I want to do better. For you, for myself." The students looked at one another, their expressions shifting toward cautious hope. The spiky-haired boy stepped forward and bowed. Then the auburn-haired girl bowed. One by one, the circle of students bowed. Not to worship Keller, but to acknowledge his willingness to change. The gesture humbled him more than anything else had. Jim rested his hand on Rex's head. The German shepherd glanced up at him, tail finally relaxing. Raymond exhaled deeply, leaning against the old wooden railing that bordered the footpath. He looked at Jim with a mixture of gratitude and respect. "You reminded him," Raymond said quietly, "what strength looks like." Jim gave a subtle shrug, his breath misting the air. "Just did what needed to be done." The tall veteran chuckled. "That's what all the good ones say?" The older woman in the gray parka nodded. "Sometimes," she said softly, "the greatest warriors are the quietest ones." With the tension dissolved, the field felt warmer despite the icy wind. Students began helping Keller brush the snow off his GI. Parents relaxed their shoulders. The world moved again. Jim placed a hand gently on Raymond's back. "Let's get you checked out," Jim said. Raymond nodded, stepping carefully to avoid straining bruised ribs. Keller stepped forward awkwardly. "Mr. Cole," he said, tone respectful, "if you ever want to visit the dojo, the door is open. No fee." Raymond chuckled through the pain. "Maybe once I stop feeling like a snowplow hit me." Jim allowed himself a small smile as he turned to leave with Rex and Raymond. The students watched him go, their faces reflecting admiration and newfound understanding. The older woman gave Jim a nod of gratitude. Keller lowered his gaze, humbled but changed. And in that cold Alaska morning, the lesson became clear, not one about kicking or striking, but about the courage it takes to own your mistakes and rise better than before. Jim stood with his boots half sunk in the soft layer of snow, watching as Keller addressed his students with a humbleness that felt foreign on his usually rigid face. The morning sun had begun to push light through the fog, illuminating the field in warm gold. Keller brushed remaining snow off his GI, breathing deeply as if preparing for a new beginning. "Mr. Walker," Keller said, voice steady but respectful, "I would like to invite you to the dojo, to teach the students what real discipline looks like." His tone carried sincerity, not fear, not pride, just a genuine desire to improve. Jim glanced at the circle of students, their faces filled with curiosity, respect, and hope. He nodded slowly. "Maybe," Jim said. "We'll see." Keller's eyes softened. Not disappointment, but gratitude for even the possibility. The girl with auburn hair and freckles looked relieved. She had admired Keller for years, and seeing him take responsibility eased something inside her. The tall boy with glasses pushed his frames up with a snowy finger, whispering, He's changing. A cold breeze tugged gently at Jim's military cold-weather parka, lifting the collar against his jaw. Rex moved closer, brushing against Jim's leg, tail low and relaxed. It was as though Rex understood the confrontation had ended, not with victory, but with transformation. The older veteran with the trimmed gray beard stepped forward, his heavy brown coat swaying as he moved. "Walker," he said with a half-smile, "you walk like someone who's used to leaving places better than you found them." His deep-set eyes carried warmth and familiarity, perhaps a reflection of men he had served beside long ago. Jim returned a modest nod. "Just did what was needed." The veteran chuckled. "Semper Fi, huh?" Beside him, the bald veteran with the thick scarf nodded enthusiastically, face wrinkling with a satisfied smile. Their presence lent a layer of solidarity to the moment, a silent salute from one generation of fighters to another. Raymond Cole approached, walking carefully to avoid aggravating the bruises on his ribs. His silver hair shimmered under the sunlight, and though still sore, his steps held renewed strength. Rex padded forward to greet him, nuzzling gently against the old veteran's leg. Raymond chuckled, a tired but genuine sound. "Your dog's got better instincts than half the platoon I served with," Raymond said. Jim smiled lightly. "Rex usually knows when a fight's worth having." Raymond's eyes softened as he looked at Jim. "Semper Fi, Marine." The words carried the weight of camaraderie, respect, and memories neither man had spoken aloud. Some of the parents gathered at the edge of the field approached cautiously. A man in his late 40s with a salt and pepper beard and a navy puffer jacket introduced himself as Mark. His voice was warm and steady. "Thank you," Mark said. "My daughter trains under Keller. She's learned a lot, but I think today she learned something more important." A woman beside him, short, bundled in a red parka, cheeks flushed from cold, added, "You reminded all of them what leadership looks like." Jim acknowledged their words with a quiet nod, uncomfortable with praise but respectful of their sincerity. The parents' expressions held gratitude, relief, and newfound trust. The students, still processing everything, gathered in a loose semicircle. The blue-haired girl stepped ahead of the group, her pale cheeks blushing pink under the cold. "Mr. Walker, thank you," she said. "I didn't know someone could win a fight without throwing a punch." The spiky-haired boy scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "Sensei always told us control was everything. Guess we forgot to hold him to the same standard." Keller overheard, but didn't react defensively. Instead, he nodded, acknowledging the truth in the boy's words. "That's on me," Keller said, "and it changes today." The older woman in the gray parka, whom no one seemed to know by name, stepped closer. Her soft brown eyes glimmered with approval. "You gave that man a gift, Mr. Walker," she said gently. "Not many people can take another person's anger and turn it into something good." Jim met her gaze, sensing wisdom behind her calm demeanor. "Sometimes people forget who they wanted to become," she continued. "Takes a moment like this to remind them." Her voice was calm, soothing, like someone who had weathered storms of her own. Jim offered a respectful nod before she quietly stepped back into the watching crowd. Rex circled Jim again before stopping to sit between Raymond and Jim. Keller approached cautiously, not as an instructor but as a man seeking redemption. "I'd like to start fresh," Keller said. "Not just with you, but with all of them." He gestured to the students behind him. "If you ever decide to visit the dojo, it would mean a lot." Jim didn't make promises. "Maybe another day," he said. "Right now, Jim nodded toward Raymond, "needs a checkup before those ribs turn into something worse." Keller looked at Raymond with genuine remorse. "If you need a ride to urgent care, I'll take you," Keller offered. Raymond smiled politely. "I'll manage. This old body's seen worse winters." Raymond patted Jim on the shoulder, his weathered fingers pressing through the heavy fabric of the parka. "I owe you one, Marine," Raymond said. "You stepped in when you didn't have to." Jim shook his head. "Wasn't about owing anything." He glanced around at the field, now calmer, brighter, filled with people whose perspectives had shifted. "Besides, sometimes people just need a reminder." Raymond laughed softly. "If that was a reminder, I'd hate to see the full lecture." Jim turned to leave, Rex rising swiftly to follow. The crunch of snow beneath their boots echoed, across the field. The morning sun broke fully through the clouds, illuminating the scene behind them. The park, an ordinary stretch of snow just minutes earlier, now felt like a place where something important had happened. Parents stood talking in low, reflective tones. Students surrounded Keller, who spoke honestly about his mistakes. The veterans lingered, swapping stories and nodding proudly at Jim's retreating figure. As Jim and Rex reached the edge of the park, Jim looked back one last time. Keller was bowing to his students, not out of formality but out of respect. For them, for the art, for the lesson. Raymond leaned on a railing, warming his hands, his expression peaceful. The woman in the gray parka stood with her hands clasped, watching everything unfold with quiet satisfaction. The world felt a little quieter, a little safer, and a little more honorable. Jim adjusted the collar of his parka and began walking down the snowy path. Rex trotted beside him, tail relaxed, paws leaving a trail of prints behind them. The cold Alaskan air carried a sense of closure, transformation, and the silent promise of new beginnings. Whatever happened next in that dojo, that class, or that park, one thing was certain. They had all been changed by what they witnessed. And Jim Walker, as always, walked on without expecting anything in return. On a quiet, snowy morning in Alaska, no one expected that a small moment in a park could change a man, a class, and even an entire community. But sometimes, God allows us to witness simple things that carry powerful reminders, gentle whispers that humility, integrity, and quiet courage are still very much alive in this world. Jim Walker didn't use his fists. He didn't raise his voice. He simply carried the calm strength that God placed in him, a strength rooted in compassion and self-control. And it was that spirit, not force, that transformed the heart of a man who had lost his way. In our daily lives, each of us faces moments where pride overshadows kindness. But if we pause, listen, and choose peace over anger, we may become the small miracle God sends to someone else. May God guide us all to walk with humility, courage, and a heart willing to uplift others. May God bless, protect, and bring peace to everyone watching this story.